Thank you. Great. Hello, folks. Hello. Welcome. This is our first of several lectures in spring. Thank you for coming. Good to see you all. For those of you coming in, plenty of seats in the front, as usual. Anybody who's in an uncomfortable seat, we've got the cushy seats out here as well. Please feel free to relocate. We're super thrilled to offer today's lecture. I'm going to kick things off by reading our land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we acknowledge the truth that's often buried, that we're on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are the ancestral stewards of this sacred land. It's their historical responsibility to advocate for the four-legged, the winged, those that crawl, and those that swim. They remind us that clean air and pristine waterways are essential to all life. This land acknowledgement is a vocal reminder for each of us as two-leggeds to ensure that our physical environment's in better condition than what we inherited, for the health and prosperity of future generations. We also acknowledge that throughout our history, our university has not always lived up to our ideals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and today we reaffirm our commitment to building and celebrating a multicultural community. So please take a moment to consider these many legacies of bias, prejudice, violence, and settlement that bring us here today. So to continue on with introductions, I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Madeline Simon, and she'll introduce our special guests.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, I am so pleased to introduce you to Joseph Kunkel and to welcome Joe back to the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Joe is principal of Mass Design Group, where he leads the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab. Just 15 years ago, Joe was completing his thesis here at the University of Maryland. And the year before that, I think, was when I first met him, when he enrolled in my graduate architecture design studio. What was really memorable about that year was that Joe and his friend and fellow University of Maryland student Alec Deary, Joe came to me with a proposal, or rather, it was more of an announcement, that he was creating a summer program that would bring University of Maryland students to, the Northern Cheyenne tribal community in Montana, which is his own tribal home. Well, at that time I was architecture program director, so it was my challenge, responsibility, and really pleasure to figure out, how do you make a program like this happen? It was essentially an international education program that was to take place within the boundaries of the continental United States. And it was a student-initiated program, which was, I think, kind of unheard of. Usually, summer programs, are initiated by faculty. So it seemed like there were insurmountable challenges, but Joe is not one to accept no for an answer ever. So somehow together we all made it happen. The program ran, it was a great success. I'm pretty sure it ran for 2 years, and wonderfully it survives today, although it has morphed into a basketball clinic where Joe and Alec go out every summer to the reservation, and they have brought with them a group of the top basketball coaches from around the country. So the connection continues. The concept of that education abroad at home program was to get University of Maryland students onto tribal lands to work with the youth of the community to learn about the issues of community development and housing development, to inspire the tribal youth to think about the possibility of their own education in architecture. So that I think planted the seeds of the career that Joe has created and advanced over the last 15 years. His next step at Maryland was a thesis in tribal housing. And from there, he launched his architectural career, working at Air St. Gross, and on the side, doing the projects that were really his passion, advancing the notion of housing design for Indigenous people, and working towards making this his career. So the next step is that Joe founded his own practice, and he has been supported along the way and received incredible recognition and financial support from an array of organizations. The Enterprise Rose Foundation provided an early career fellowship that gave him the opportunity to move to Santa Fe and engage full-time in the practice of developing housing for Indigenous peoples. This resulted in a really groundbreaking project that began to set the standard for Indigenous housing. And I think that the next, really huge recognition was the Obama Fellowship. So I learned more about Joe's work this fall when he very generously came to speak to my new class in design thinking for the entrepreneurial architect. And on that occasion, I really got the kind of full, well, perhaps full, I'll say fuller glimpse of how entrepreneurial Joe has been in his career. He brings this tremendously nimble mindset to all the work that he engages in. And I would just say that his success is attributable to many things. One is just a clear vision and a real sense of personal mission. Ever since Joe began his search for grad schools, he was very clear about what his life work would be. And along the way, I think that the fellowship opportunities have afforded him the opportunity to broaden his knowledge and skill set. And I was just tremendously struck by his ability to understand both the everyday issues of the people that he designs for, and also the development process, the funding and financing aspects of actually getting the work done getting the work built and transforming people's lives through architecture. So maybe I should wrap it up. Before this fall, the last time I'd seen Joe was at a wonderful dinner over at the Alumni Center, where the University of Maryland gave him the inaugural Elaine Johnson Coates Award. So it's great to see Joe back at the University of Maryland, and I am looking forward to your talk, and I ask you all to join me in welcoming Joseph Kunkel back to school.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Maddie. Quick question, do we have a slide advancer, or do I have to use the keyboard? Use the keyboard, okay. I also have I should have one in my bag if that's helpful. Can I just plug one in? Yeah, I might be moving around and doing some gymnastics on the stage, and so while I'm doing a little bit of prep here, thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be back at Maryland. It's a large audience. Not too long ago, I was sitting in your seat, kind of attending these Wednesday evening lectures, trying to kind of think about ways in which maybe I would contribute to the practice, and also questioning practice and what it would be. I'm not going to talk specifically about the housing work that I've been doing. I'm going to talk more about it in the context of policy, and try and unpack it a little bit and how that might inform the design that we do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about two projects, one that's in construction, actually both that are in construction, and one that's finishing up. But wanted to kind of start with just thanking the school for the invitation to give a talk and share some of the work that we've been doing, and also thank everyone, those that maybe are online watching and participating, that this isn't my work alone, right? This is a work of many people. And this is also kind of the support of many that help mentor me, that help kind of get me to this point. I wouldn't have been able to do it by myself. And so this is very much a collaborative effort in the work that we do. So similar to how we opened up with an acknowledgement, I also want to acknowledge and kind of share that our acknowledgement. We all today are located on the lands that have long been the center for Native people. This evening, we find ourselves on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. We honor these people, past, present, and future, along with the many other Indigenous peoples who inhabit, continue to inhabit, hold sacred, and steward these lands. We must also acknowledge the more than 12 million African ancestors who were stolen from their communities and forced into unpaid labor on these stolen lands. As we come together today, we ask ourselves to question continually how our work is lifting up the future envisioned by the communities that we serve. And that's how we tend to approach every project. We are working with the community, not for the community, and trying to ensure that their voices are at the table when we approach the work that we do. So today, the DC metro area is called home for approximately 4,000 urban natives. Approximately 72% of all Native Americans live in and or around urban areas. We all don't live on tribal reservations. There are 574 federally recognized tribes. Just over 300 of those tribes have tribal reservations. And so there's a large amount that don't have tribal trust lands. And we'll go into some of the nuance in the language that I'm using in a moment. So, and this is a quote from President Barack Obama when he established the Bears Ears National Monument. And in quotes, traditional ecological knowledge is itself a resource to be protected and used in understanding and managing this landscape sustainably for generations to come. And so when we're often thinking about the work that we're doing, we're not only thinking about the community, but we're genuinely thinking about the connection to place, the connection to land, the connection to these areas that are sacred to the many peoples that call these places home. And so a question for you all is, as you think about this work, as you think about the work that you're doing, and similar to, I had some time to sit with Ronit's class, thinking about the places that you all come from. And so how do you define home? And what does home mean to you? Because there's many different definitions of what that looks like, similar to how there's many different histories of where we all come from. And I use histories plural because Indigenous peoples, Native peoples all have their own histories and how they connect to place. So defining home in Indian country has been a career process for me. And it's different in every one of the communities that we serve. And so in doing so, I had to kind of back up and try and unpack, how do we get to home? And in what ways are we kind of trying to understand the notion of home? And so I had to kind of, and this is much of my thesis work, kind of bouncing back and forth between Western Eurocentric ideologies of home and kind of the Indigenous perspectives of home. And my language, I will acknowledge that my language has changed over time. And I didn't always get it right. And that's something that I think we just also need to reconcile with and wrestle with. And so how did we get here? And I'm going to do a couple slides that the print might be too small. This is the first time I'm giving this type of lecture. I'm going to run through it. So this is a test run, so be kind. How did we get here? And where do we find ourselves when it relates to Indigenous housing or Native housing? And so that's not, I've got a big screen. You can see the text, that's good. So pre-contact, we would kind of call attention to the notion of home and the notion of what it meant for Indigenous housing. And this is something that, for those that are going through architectural theory classes, history classes, we designed for place, right? Whether it was the Southwest, the Southeast, the Pacific Northwest, the housing reflected the typologies and the regions in which you were building, right? And that was really important. 1492, European contact. And I'm gonna, on the top is also in line with kind of the African-American experience, which is trying to kind of see where we are in Indian country as we kind of go along lines with kind of African-American history, right? And so 1619, first record of Africans forcibly taken to Virginia. 1641, Massachusetts recognized slavery as a legal institution. As this is happening, the Spaniards are kind of moving up from Central America into the Southwest, right? And starting to confront Pueblo communities, Indigenous communities in the Southwest. And there was a Pueblo revolt, right? So the Southwest was not US territory at the time. And this was still kind of being conquered by the Spanish. And so this idea of the Pueblo revolt, Indigenous peoples are fighting Western people, and this is kind of going back and forth. 1784, the Treaty of Hopewell, 1830, the Indian Removal Act. So we're kind of very quickly getting into Western expansion, right? And what, the United States government is starting to place Native Americans on tribal reservations. It's like, we don't know what to do with you all, so we're gonna place you in these places and on these reservations, and you can't leave these places. 1863, the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. 1886, Geronimo is forcibly placed onto tribal reservation lands. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but not equal doctrine is being passed. And then the 1887 Dawes Act, which is basically Senator Dawes is coming in and saying, we're going to civilize you. We're going to place you on tribal trust lands or allotted lands and basically give you land to experience the American dream, right? You get to live on this land, cultivate it, make it your own, and profit from it. Kind of breaking apart the nuances of Indigenous cultures, right? The communal cultures that made community kind of whole. And so it's kind of this notion from community values to individual values. And we're kind of trying to wrestle with that as we try and understand what our communities or how our communities are being developed. So in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act is being kind of notions of redlining. 1937 Housing Act, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, basically from Washington, DC, is trying to massively put out housing across the country, right? And trying to design housing, and I would say, in some ways, trying to do what they just could wrap their heads around. How do you mass produce a lot of housing for people that need it and do it efficiently? And so that was kind of the efficient solution to bringing housing to rural communities, to tribal communities, to urban communities, but doing it out of context. 1956, the Indian Relocation Act. Okay, we're on tribal trust lands. You all are not progressing. How do we kind of ensure that you have access to jobs? And so Indigenous populations were relocated from tribal reservations to urban centers with the idea that you would be able to get a job and assimilate faster and become part of society. 1964, the occupation of Alcatraz, basically lifting up that abandoned US lands, federal lands, if abandoned for a period of time, tribes can start to occupy them and take them back. And so as this is happening, you can kind of see the civil rights movement on the top, moving alongside Indigenous rights movements. And then kind of lastly, I would say, while I critique the federal government, I also want to lift up the kind of positive things. I wouldn't totally call out Senator Dawes, the 1937 Housing Act, as negative. It was kind of Western or European ways of thinking, trying to solve issues that they didn't necessarily know how to solve. But in the late 80s, early 90s, Native Americans, American Indians that were going to higher education, we're starting to try and understand how can they influence tribal housing policy and ways of thinking about community development. And so the HUD Section 184 Loan Guarantee Program, or the HUD 184 program as more recently known, finally started to solve some of the issues that we see on tribal trust lands, right? So this loan guarantee program that is guaranteed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development basically allows banking institutions the ability to lend onto tribal trust lands, right? So if you think about it, and I'm going to go into what tribal trust lands versus fee simple land look like, but tribal trust lands, your typical banking institutions, the Banks of Americas, the Wells Fargos, typically need some semblance of collateral to give debt equity to, or a conventional loan, a mortgage. And so typically when you're buying a piece of land, that title to that land is that honor for the banking institution to give a mortgage to. They're mortgaging, and then as you pay that back, you build wealth. Well, this HUD 184 loan product was the start, and this is 1992. This is the first time that a mortgage, you're able to kind of get a mortgage to build your own house on your own land. And so that's kind of, I mean, it's not all that long ago. 1996, NAHASDA, the Native American Housing and Self-Determination Act, is basically giving self-determination to tribes, right? Moving from that, and prior to that, many tribes were operating under the 1937 Housing Act. And so it was some time before NAHASDA was passed that tribes at this point get to self-determine what we think housing should look like on our own tribal trust lands, which is kind of mind-blowing. I'd imagine this is in everybody's lifetime, I hope, as I look out into the audience. The 2012 HEARTH Act, or the Helping Expedite Advance Responsible Tribal Home Ownership, is basically moving from a title status report where tribes have to lean on the federal government for their title status reports, or TSRs, to advancing tribes to be in control of that, right? And so we're moving, these policies on the bottom, the first three that you see on your left, are pretty progressive, as it means as turning over power to tribes and allowing tribes to make these decisions as we move forward in community development. And so today, as tribes build that capacity to do their own development, we're looking at ways in which we're building the capacity of tribes to do this, while also pushing forward innovative ways in which tribes are doing this. And so we have the whole spectrum of how we're thinking about this work. And this is in many ways how we're looking at it. Laws, land, labor, lending, and lumber. The last one is a little bit, it's more materials, but how we build, not totally just lumber. So I'm going to go in sequence, trying to touch base on laws and approaching them from a Eurocentro perspective to kind of an indigenous or an indigeneity perspective. So a lot of the terminology I kind of introed with might be foreign to many of you, and we're going to try and break that down a little bit. So I was introduced as a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. I'm also a citizen of the United States of America. As being considered a sovereign, we are a political body, and that's important to lift up. We have the ability to create our own laws, leverage our own courts, create our own banking systems, lending systems. And so that ability to be sovereign is important. We're not a state, subdivision, corporation, or nonprofit organizations. We have the ability to have a government-to-government relationship with the federal government. And so indigeneity, when we think about laws in the kind of indigenous perspective, sophisticated laws and agreements between indigenous tribes and bands become kind of the focus there. The US constitutional language references the Mohawk and Lenape languages as core concepts and forming language of the United States Constitution. And in many ways, to kind of integrate these Western ways of thinking, President Lincoln also gave canes to the Pueblo peoples. Western ideologies, right? Federal governments create these relationships with congressionally appointed tribes and treaty tribes. There are also congressionally appointed tribes, right? To be considered a federally recognized tribe at the time, as the United States government was expanding westward, you had to create treaties with tribal communities. Today, and so in many ways, you're either a treaty tribe or a congressionally appointed tribe. Today, you can only be a congressionally appointed tribe. The United States Congress has to designate you as a federally recognized tribe. When I started this work, there was approximately just under 550 tribes that were federally recognized. That has kind of ballooned in the past, I guess, 15 years since I graduated, to 574 tribes. And this creates many barriers to federal programs. Kind of want to highlight, while being federally recognized does give you access, and so some of the treaty, right, to create a treaty and sign over your land, you gave up your access to land. But you also, in giving up that land, the US government promised schools, housing, food, healthcare, and in many ways, they're kind of under-delivering, which we're going to kind of talk to, and hopefully I'll get into two projects that lift up how we're pushing the bounds of what that might look like in years to come. So laws are future, and kind of proposing, and that bar is not supposed to be there, but as we kind of think about the laws, how can we think beyond capitalism to imagine new realities that elevate tribal sovereignty and traditional economies, right? This notion of, when I kind of alluded to how we built an immense amount of wealth in this country, was through land ownership and through kind of devaluing the labor in which we built on this land. How do we kind of rethink that and really push the bounds of what sovereignty and self-determination can be, redefining wealth, building on our communities. And I'd say this doesn't only have to be particular or specific to our tribal communities. I think what we're trying to do in the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab is understand how the work that we're doing in Indian country can impact non-native contexts as well. So land, all lands are indigenous, and that's part of the acknowledgement that you heard at the beginning of the lecture. That's like a little bit of what that land acknowledgement is doing. That's like, we got to go much further than just the land acknowledgement, but that's for another conversation. Indian or indigenous lands have a unique relationship between Indian peoples. Land can be a keeper of memories, a portal to the spirit world, or a place to go for guidance and strength. And this is another mentor, Chris Stainbrook. He is the CEO of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And it's going much more past than this has value, right? This land is more than just dollars and cents. It's about a history. It's about the memories of a place. And you can't value that in the way in which a Western context does. Since time immemorial, right? These lands blurred across what is now North America. And we didn't necessarily we didn't define them by these kind of abstract lines that define our states or counties or so on. And so they kind of blurred across boundaries. And so this is important to understand, that it's not, that it is a blurring of place, that you get to kind of inhabit many different locations at one time. Western ideologies, right? This idea that from 1776 to present, we get to start to kind of create these barriers and these territories and these states that really start to kind of what is basically a settler colonial perspective of how you're dividing up land, right? And that was basically the 1785 National Land Ordinance, which you see when you fly over kind of middle America. You can very clearly see those acre sites, and for those that have taken your urban seminar, you kind of learn that very clearly. And there's kind of perceptions of infinite amount of resources, right? This idea that the economy is going to continue to grow 2, 3, 5% forever. That perspective is not held in many Indigenous communities. So we can't keep creating and creating and creating and taking and taking and taking. There's going to be ramifications. And so how do we kind of process that as we move forward? 1887 to 1995, the government creates slow and difficult to navigate policies in response to harmful and legislative practices, right? And this idea that in order for us to operate in Western society, we have to navigate kind of these kind of obscure ways to access dollars, to access land, to access our ability to navigate Western society, whether it's school, professional practice, like being an adult in Western society. It's just really hard to navigate. And this is still to today when we think about our ways of navigating housing policy. It's not very clear all the time. You need to, and sometimes, be a lawyer to navigate how to put together an Indian housing block grant or Indian community development block grant. And that's not a skill set that everybody has in these communities. And so I kind of talked a little bit about the Dawes Act, and these are kind of opposing perspectives, right? And so Charlotte Blackelt, instead of saying you are a group of people, all of a sudden you're an individual landowner. You're an American. The Indian may, and this is coming from Senator Dawes, the Indian may now become a free man, free from the thraldom of the tribe, free from the domination of the reservation system, free to enter into the bodies of our citizens, right? It's moving from being a tribal member to a citizen of a country that you didn't know you belonged to. And so this is, I mean, this is history, but it's also happening today. And so you can kind of see it repeating itself. 1937 Housing Act, these houses left little connection to traditional ways of life, a far step from the Pueblo homes of the Southwest or the longhouses of the Pacific Northwest, which were not only culturally significant, but climate specific, right? Again, building in relationship to the context and the places that you're coming from was important. The passing of the 1937 Housing Act seemed to signal a large-scale, long-term public commitment to do what the private housing industry had not. And that's basically trying to, and we see this, right? In today's society, we need a lot of affordable housing. And when I say affordable, not only kind of low income, those that kind of apply for a lot of the federal programs, but the middle income populations can't seem to kind of break into the housing market. And so that's also important to lift up, that construction's not going to get it. We can't like construct our way out of this problem. Construction prices are going to be what they are. And so we have to figure out how are we working within these systems to afford the possibilities for individuals to gain access to the housing market, right? Post-World War II was the biggest boom that we saw in terms of wealth creation. And why was that? It was partly due to our abilities to kind of access the GI Bill, right? People coming back from war had, and mainly white males, had access to the GI Bill to kind of buy a home and create immense amounts of wealth for future generations. And that's important to kind of lift up, that African Americans, Indigenous, immigrants didn't necessarily have access to those policies. Relocation Act of 1956, right? An underfunded, ill-conceived program, essentially a one-way ticket from a rural to urban poverty, right? You have all the federal programs as a federally recognized tribe on your tribal reservation, but those programs don't translate to an urban context. And so there's a disconnect there in terms of how you're navigating these two spaces, these two places. Some Indians, as this man from Wisconsin, do so well, they become a foreman, right? Like, what do you do? Nahasda, Congress has kept funding for the Indian Housing Block Grant at stagnant levels for more than 20 years, right? If we just look at it, when I kind of entered into this, trying to kind of navigate the Indian Housing Block Grant, Indian Community Development Block Grant, we were about $80 million going to 574 federally recognized tribes. Right now, we're just under $1 billion. That's about $2 million per tribe per year. Break that down, that's maybe 3, 4, 5 units of housing maybe on the tribal reservation. It'd take about 120, 130 years to build the current need that we see in Indian country, which is around 200,000 units of housing, right? We can't just solve it with the federal dollars. We can leverage these federal dollars, but we also have to kind of fall back on the private market. And we need access to larger capital if we're gonna create some solutions here. Since it was the first signed into law in 1996, Nahasda has provided billions in federal dollars to tribes and Native communities in Hawaii and across the country. Yes, that's true, but we don't necessarily, it's not necessarily going to the construction of our built environment, right? We need to, as we build the capacity of our tribal communities, this money's going to overhead. This money's going to building the capacity of our professional kind of development groups, right? So if you have a tribal housing authority, you need to pay your staff, you need to pay the executive directors, the staff, the maintenance crew, all the professional services. So what might be a $2 million grant that you get every year, maybe only 1.2, 1.5 million of that goes to construction. And so you got to balance that as we move forward. So ONAP, or the Office of Native American Programs, is established in 1993, increases the ability to kind of bring technical assistance to Indian country, right? We can pass Nahasda, we can kind of move billions and millions of dollars to Indian country, but what good is that money if you don't necessarily have the technical skills to execute and leverage those dollars well? The HUD 184 guarantee program, kind of look through the Title VI loan guarantee program, and I'm going through a lot of policies that are they're not gonna stick at this immediate moment, but that's fine. But the Title VI loan guarantee program allows a tribal community to leverage a year in advance its federal dollars to compound and access those dollars immediately if they can prove to the federal government that they're gonna use the funding well. And that can be at times tension, right? If you don't have the accounting structure, you don't have the legal structure in place, the federal government's gonna be, we don't really trust you with all this money. We don't think you're gonna use it well, and I'm paraphrasing. And so that's basically what they're saying. But you gotta be able to kind of prove to the federal government that you can leverage these dollars. So you do have that kind of person overhead trying to keep account. And then the Hearth Act, the helping expedite affordable, responsible tribal housing, which I think is a progress forward. So moving to, if we were kind of pause there for a moment and think about land, our future, how can federal, state, and tribal governments collaborate to designate a land use structure that favors stewardship over ownership? And I think that's the takeaway from this kind of section of land, right? We're not here to kind of own land in perpetuity and just pass it and create immense amount of wealth. We need to kind of, and this is, I mean, if we double down and think about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the kind of Inflation Reduction Act, this notion of stewardship is immensely important if we're going to kind of continue to think about how we operate and work in space and time. Labor, we're not rebuilding tribal nations. We are rebuilding tribal nations by building people. And that's important when we kind of reflect on tribal sovereignty, right? It's about building the people so that we can kind of move forward prerogatives. If we're just, so falling back on some of the housing that we've built within our organization, that 41 unit housing project at Santo Domingo, the kind of Wadi housing project that if you look back on our website or you look at any previous recordings that I've talked about, the Wadi housing project's usually kind of at the forefront. It's a great project, built 41 units of housing, 41 art studios, and a 3,000 square foot community center. But did we build the capacity for the community to rebuild it again and again and again and again? And to be critical upon our own work, I'd say no. And so we need to be building the capacity of organizations to kind of replicate the work time and time and time again. And that's the notion of building people and then building the capacity within people. From an Indigenous standpoint, traditional roles within the community are grounded in social structures, which still exist today. Ownership means taking care of something until it's passed on, right? And so these multiple generations living under one roof, culture is kind of passed on from generation to generation. Service of community is part of your everyday. And then this notion of place is lifted up, right? In Renee's class, I kind of alluded to if you are called back as a tribal leader, if you are called to be governor or called to be on tribal council, you leave your everyday job and participate in community for that year to 2 years of service, right? If you're a lawyer in Albuquerque, you leave that job and you come back to the community to participate, right? You have an obligation to your community. And so that doesn't necessarily vibe well in the Western context, right? Can you imagine leaving your job for a year to participate in community? It doesn't kind of go one on one, right? And so Western ideologies, it's difficult to translate these kind of across boundaries, right? This notion around how many of you live in a multi-generational home? How many, it's you and your parents, or it's you and your children, right? It's not multiple generations spanning over time. Culture to money, service of community to career focus, right? Time, place, they're kind of in tension with each other, and we have to kind of recognize that. So our future, how can we use the tools of capitalism to build capacity within a culturally competent way in rural and urban Indigenous communities? And you probably have heard the word decolonize, like how are we decolonizing these spaces? If we think about it, and you kind of break apart the word decolonize, mainly to kind of literally get rid of the colonizers. And I don't think, I'd love to kind of think about, but I have a lot of friends that come from from colonizers. So how do we instead indigenize the spaces? It's hard for me to kind of think about me decolonizing the spaces in which we're working in, because it took generations to colonize this place. We need to kind of back up for a second and say, okay, we can't be responsible for all that. We need to kind of bring our attention to this place and do what we can within this space and within the context of what we have power to do. And then hopefully others are doing that within circles, and it amplifies over and over and over again. 2 more, and then 2 projects, I promise, not too much. So lending, and we talked a little bit about this, Indigenous wealth, right? And I'm gonna blank out man and woman. I'm just gonna kind of replace that with person. A person is rich in proportion to the number of things they can afford to let alone, right? And in many, kind of, especially in my culture, it's the kind of nuances, like the chief is the poorest person in the community because they give everything back to the community, right? And it's like a number of like how much you can afford to give up. And that's how you define wealth. And that is in tension again with Western ideologies, right? Multi-generational communities support and systems of trade, right? Instead of trading with money or kind of, you have a good, I'm gonna pay for that good, you give me that good. We're gonna trade and barter back and forth with things. Like you make a jacket, I make the pants, we go back and forth. Growing, providing, gifting, and receiving is kind of the notion of how you operate in this space. Western ideologies, wealth is about keeping rather than sharing, right? I'm gonna work and I'm gonna save, and I'm going to save for that car or save for that house, and it's kind of intention. Primary methods of wealth generation requires property ownership, which many people just don't have access to. Complex processes hinder use of federal resources. Capacity to issue and salary disparities cause retention issues in tribal organizations, i.e. turnover. And we see this all the time. This is not specific to Indian country. This is also probably a caveat that we see in rural communities too, right? An executive director at a tribal housing authority who's making $65,000, $80,000 in a for-profit development corporation could make triple that, right? And so why am I gonna stay in this place where I need to get ahead? And that's, again, in tension with each other. So we need to build that capacity, and in some ways, and I tell this to all my design students and aspiring, you value your time. That's a Western perspective, and you can't kind of give that up, but you also have to fall back on your cultural ideologies and cultural values. So how can we support an infrastructure that develops and sustains assets within the tribal organizations and communities, right? We want to build the capacity, building the people, building the corporations and organizations that we're investing in long term. And then lastly, lumber, right? And this is more about material. This is about how we kind of build things. Federal funding for housing is insufficient and needlessly complex, right? Especially in rural communities. How do you get stuff to a remote community? It's expensive. It's very expensive. When we think about, and in today's society, we kind of reconcile back or kind of go back to kind of pre-contact. Design and structures reflected the communities and places in which they were built. Communities are resourceful and adaptable to their surroundings, right? Some of you might notice the sketch in the back. That is a sketch of Taos Pueblo, right? It is somewhat frozen in time, but it is an example of a mud brick village, of an adobe village. And so I live in an adobe home. How do we think about using the materials that are local to where we are building and designing? And that's important, right? And this is, intention kind of alluded to this earlier in the conversation, right? Regionally and culturally specific typologies to that image on the right, which could be anywhere reservation, anywhere rural community, USA. It's placeless. It doesn't necessarily reflect the culture of the community or places in which they are being built, right? And this happened through globalization, and as we kind of developed into how we think about our built environment, right? 20th century globalization of design and construction moves away from honoring local cultures, communities, regions, and climates, right? We have air conditioning. We can basically cool a building in 120-degree weather. We don't have to worry about our comfortability, right? If it goes above 72, we're gonna push it down to 68, right? We don't like being uncomfortable in these places. And so I think in many ways we have to start being comfortable being uncomfortable. And so this idea of being regionally specific is kind of more important today than in any time that we're seeing. Complexity of building and processes make housing harder to fix on your own without specific skill sets. And we see this, like, not to name names, but your affordable, like if you're built, I liken when we think about housing in Indian country, and for those that are first-time renters or first-time home buyers, and you don't grow up in a home where you're taking care of a house, it's almost like giving the keys to a Ferrari to somebody that doesn't know how to drive. And so how can you, and then whose fault is it? Is it the person that's giving the keys or the person that's accepting the keys, right? And there's nuance there that we have to try and unpack. If you don't know how to change your filter, and your filter is clogged, and it's running overtime and increasing your energy bills, and you're paying $400 or $500 a month on energy costs, whose fault is that when it's a $5 filter to replace, right, every 3 months or every 6 months? That's important to kind of lift up. And so as designers that are putting specifications out there, we have to understand like what is easy to fix, what is not easy to fix, and how are we kind of understanding those nuances. So our future, how can we set a standard that prioritizes the need and values of families, communities, and places? And then this is a picture of a project that I'm going to kind of go into that talks about the Child Care Center, or the Caddo Child Care Center in Hinton, Oklahoma. And so we're going to go from housing over to, and I'm going to put I think, a kind of future a call to action before we get to that. And this is by President Biden on a proclamation of Indigenous Peoples Day. We have more to do to help lift tribal communities from the shadows of our broken promises, to protect the rights to vote and help them access other opportunities that their ancestors were long denied. And so access to housing, access to healthcare, access to food, access to healthcare. Housing, I think, from an organization, from what I think we can try and understand that and communicate that. What we're trying to now do is understand the food systems in which we're working, understand the healthcare systems that we're working, and try and understand the educational systems that we're working, and how can we be providing more perspectives and thought leadership to ensure that tribes have the ability to navigate these spaces. I'm going to touch on that in a moment. So in practice, how are we doing this? This is a spectrum of engagement, and we tend to be on that left side when we're practicing and when we start our projects, right? Not mass, but I think as a design profession, we tend to be ignoring, placating, tokenizing when we talk about community engagement, right? We're doing it a surface level. And so how do we do that deep community engagement to understand the places in which we're working? And that's important. Because if we aren't, we're not doing the community justice. Or from the perspective of where we're working, we're trying, nearly impossible to get to defer to, mainly because the community doesn't necessarily always own those kind of assets in which we're designing. And so it's hard to kind of put a value on that. But we hope that we're getting to this notion around involving, lifting up the community's voice, delegating power, collaborating, and ensuring that we're bringing a skill set to the table when we engage with the communities. We bring technical skill sets as designers, as architects, as engineers, but we're in some ways listening to the community. I like to lift up that the community is the kind of architect of their own vision. That vision is a long-term commitment to change. And so hopefully we're getting to that kind of involving and voicing, and the two projects that I'll share will hopefully show that the voices are being lifted up, and in some ways we're starting to delegate power. I'd say we have a long way to go to getting this notion of community ownership at the forefront. So that was the kind of the policy part of the lecture. Now we're going to get into some of the design, and we're going to kind of go for a 360 from housing policy and trying to understand federal policy, to understand how are we lifting up community voices. And this is a project in which we're working with both Japanese Americans and Native Americans, the 5 tribes of North Dakota, to acknowledge the past injustices of Japanese Americans that were interred during World War II. And I think Taro Ina says it the best. I wouldn't maybe put it in that sense, but I think he says it well. The war has ended, but I'm still in a snow country prison. So when he left Bismarck, North Dakota, he couldn't leave that place. And so how do we honor his, and he wrote this, he has many writings. How do we kind of acknowledge those past injustices in many cases that happened on tribal reservations? And so this is an image of where we're working on a memorial project on the United Tribes Technical College. It's this courtyard project where we're working in a post-Civil War building and trying to acknowledge that this building holds a lot of history. We can't bulldoze the building, but we can kind of honor those that were interred in this building during World War II. And so this is just a kind of an overview of the various imprisonment sites that Japanese Americans were interred on, both Japanese Americans, Germans, Italians, that were kind of placed on reservations. And I think some of these graphics, for those that were on my thesis committee, like some of these graphics that I produced in thesis, I'm still kind of using today. Everything in a dark gray boundary is a tribal reservation, and so on. So confinement, family separation, and alienification continues to haunt the memories and lived experiences of many Americans, right? For Native Americans to lift up the injustices of Japanese Americans is pretty profound. Native American boarding schools, 1869 to 1960, Japanese American confinement, 1942 to 1946, present day, 1917 present, right? The immigration, the separation of families. Again, history repeating itself time and time and time again, just a little bit differently and to a different population. So resistance to settler colonialism and genocide of Native American people, Gambate, or the resistance of unlawful incarceration of Japanese Americans, the resistance of deportation and family separations at US borders. These are all kind of going in hand, right? And Gambate, which is kind of part of the concept that we're using for this memorial, is the kind of radical act of triumphing over adversity, which was adopted during the wartime incarceration as a means for resisting injustices, right? So this idea that we're going to kind of continue to fight even though we're being imprisoned. And so this ability to kind of continue to fight against the federal government. Again, I underscore that these are Japanese Americans. They're American citizens being interred on tribal lands. And so this has happened. So across generations, the spirits of resistance can also be seen within the civil rights fight and the kind of within the Native American community. And we saw this from 1940 to 1960 with the AIM movement or the American Indian movement. And this idea of resistance continues to kind of go hand in hand with many communities. And so it's similar to Gambate, we also kind of lifted up the notion of kintsugi. How do you take something that's broken and put it back together and make it more valuable in the essence of the concept? And so we tried to ensure that our design lifted up and hopefully brought together this courtyard in a more powerful way, right? Kind of taking together kind of the indigenous histories and Japanese American histories with the kind of drum circle or the taiko drummers, the notion of circle and a focal point as a kind of convening, kind of the healing and ritual space, the story and telling, using it as a means for an outdoor space to gather and kind of ripple out throughout the campus. And then find ways to reuse old material. And so that material that you see in the image to the right are old roof tiles, slate tiles that we're gonna laser engrave with the names of those that were interred at UTTC, the United Tribes Technical College. And basically use it as a way to kind of lift up their voices. And then also within that kind of slit that you see in the wall is a means, as an offering. It's a way to kind of give a paper crane or a suru as an offering, as a call to action. And then this kind of way of bringing together that center space to ensure that people have access to the courtyard space. And so in many of the ways that we were talking about the housing policy, we want to ensure that this memorial kind of makes people aware of the various issues, of the history, right? And then as you kind of move through the memorial, create a safe space, right? That kind of tension and release. The idea of finding the stories and finding your ancestors that kind of were in this place. And feeling the need, kind of feeling the feelings, but then hopefully making some sense of the story, right? As you expand into the center space or the kind of center gathering space. And then finally, ideally, you're being called to action and called to participate in this wall, in the wall itself, but also as you kind of move through the space. And so some kind of renderings as we find ourselves. We just finished this past December the decking, everything that you see in the background. That's phase one. Phase two is the memorial wall and the landscaping. We're really excited about where the project is, in part funded by the National Park Service and the school itself and the 5 tribes. So just excited to see where it is today. And as we kind of peruse through these renderings, I wanted to share a video.
My parents were in San Francisco when they were forcefully removed from their home.
My grandfather was one of those who was rounded up, arrested on the night of December 7th.
My husband's grandfather was picked up in the weeks after Pearl Harbor was bombed.
He told me how he was just given a few days' notice to pack up some bags. They were not told where they were going. They spent days on a train. They arrived at this place that was so cold in February 1945.
They were forced to address 2 loyalty questionnaires for the government to determine their loyalty, even though they had already been removed from their home.
There were lawsuits that showed that that was unconstitutional to have people renounce their citizenship under duress.
This was the government's way of legally treating them as people who had no rights. The Snow Country Prison Memorial is our story as well as the Native American story.
There is a parallel story of what happened to the Native people.
The United States did not fulfill their treaty responsibilities in the agreements that they had with the tribes. We were placed on reservation lands.
Many Japanese American concentration camps were built explicitly on reservation land.
Mass incarceration, mass removal from homes, separation of families,
Made to suffer imprisonment.
loss of material and generational wealth. All of these things have impacted both communities.
Just because they were part of an ethnic group that seemed to be in the government's way.
I come from a tribe of people called the Hunkpapa Lakota. One of the greatest, we feel, in the nation, a fellow by the name of Sitting Bull, would fit very well into this category of renunciates because he refused to accept America on its terms and conditions and said, if I'm going to accept an America, it will be on my terms and conditions.
United Tribes has existed on the Fort Lincoln site since 1968-69 when the tribes of North Dakota took over this facility.
It's as if the Native community stepped up to be compassionate witnesses about our experience, out of empathy from their own suffering.
We heard from internee survivors and internee family members about what their ideas would be to have a memorial.
And now we're here close to having the first phase of the memorial completed.
The term Snow Country Prison originates with Satsuki's father, Itaro Ina, wrote haiku poetry when he was imprisoned here at Fort Lincoln.
He wrote, "The war is over, but I'm still in a snow country prison."
One of the things that's valuable about memorials and monuments of this type are that it becomes a potential site of remembrance as well as repair.
It invites this feeling of community. People come together to learn, to share.
Kintsugi is the Japanese art form in which typically a broken pottery piece is put back together again.
And so it's a way of remembering.
And it actually gives more value to the piece of pottery. And that's reflected in the design of the walls, where the names of all the internees will be.
Using these slate pieces, building materials that were left here, now being put into another good use in the wall. The design incorporates a circular area, which can be a ceremonial circle.
We're hoping that this garden, once it's completed, will become the spiritual place for us to do ceremonies, to do recognition, to become a site that's based in spirituality.
It will be a place where our community could have events to educate and pass on the stories.
There's a natural audience of students and educators associated with the college who are going to be exposed to this on a regular basis. It's just going to be part of the college environment.
All of the elements have been in place to try to recognize what occurred here and also to try to bring about some healing.
It's an opportunity to reflect on
The stories that have been minimized and distorted.
the power of different communities to look at things with a different truth.
And that people are working together to make sure that history is told by the people who suffered.
And I believe just recognizing what happened and sharing what happened helps us move in that direction.
That being allies and friends and caring about each other and supporting one another gives us a stronger voice to prevent injustices from happening again.
Yeah. Let me exit and then reshare. Maybe not. So I said I had they told me I had an hour. I got 4 minutes. So I wanted to touch on one last project that just started construction in Hinton, Oklahoma, the Caddo Child Care Center, and kind of the essence of time. I'm going to kind of give a quick overview, and then, a quick overview of the Caddo Child Care Center, and then just quickly go into our kind of 3-minute video. You don't need to listen to my voice. You could hear the voices of the community in a lot better way. But I'm going to outline the design really quick, and then just kind of cut to the video and take some Q&A questions. But so as we kind of approach the project itself, and for those that don't know, the Caddo Nation is one of 2 tribes that are indigenous to that region of what is now the United States, Oklahoma, northern Texas, and within that region. And so for the design of the Caddo Child Care Center, and hopefully the voices will kind of talk about the nuance of the cultural connections, but we wanted to use material that uplifts cultural identity and fosters intertribal understanding. So this child care center is not only going to be a place for the Caddo, but for many of the tribes in the region. Number 2, nurtures the physical and cultural well-being of children and the families, provides and supports services to families as a foundation for success, right? And the idea is that we're starting with the children, the future tribal leaders of this community that will seed this larger 80-acre, 60-acre development site. Number 4, value and strengthens the bonds between generations. Well, there'll be a place in which elders can meet and gather with tribal youth. And then lastly, kind of understand the connection to the environment and really trying to understand how we're instilling the medicines and the plants similar to the gardens that you saw at UTTC. And I have a short video that kind of lifts up the narrative of the Caddo Child Care Center.
I was told that kids are not given to you so that you can raise them. They're given to you so that they can raise you.
And that worldview is informed by these values and beliefs that go all the way back to our origin stories about take care of each other, and be good to each other, be kind to each other, look out for each other, teach each other. That's ancient.
All of Northeast Texas, all of Southwest Arkansas, all of Northwest Louisiana, all of Eastern Oklahoma is our Aboriginal homeland. So where we're at today is our tribal jurisdiction recognized by the United States government and Congress. However, our hearts and minds are in our homelands as well.
Because we're all different tribal nations, First Nations, Aboriginal group. The effects of colonization are felt throughout the world, and it's caused a lot of historical trauma.
I'm looking at and remembering the children that are currently in our camp and their family journeys that kind of brought them here, and then what parts of Native American history have they been affected by, right? Was it boarding schools? There's some families that have been a part of the Relocation Act.
Back in the early 80s when it started, we had nothing. I mean, we were starting from the bottom, nothing, just that little shack building we had.
The number one thing was we want a building. How do we get a building?
We are willing to do the extra work to deliver the best for our children.
Every single thing we try to do is quality. We make sure that we're setting the standard. We're not just giving people the bare minimum.
The tribe, their vision and forward thinking, and Mass Design Group, who came on board, that relationship with them was invaluable.
The accessibility that we're providing families is empowering because our families just usually don't have access to the quality of care that they're going to be receiving from this facility.
Ensuring that there's a library so that if a mother is going to school or if she is taking night classes, if she wants her child to go to the facility and she wants to go in that library and study, then you don't have to leave the facility to go somewhere else. You can actually be there with your child.
It is very much geared towards community and kind of intergenerational learning and children learning within community.
They have the elders come in and tell stories to them and teach them the traditions and the cultures of our people, because a lot of the children don't get that from their parents.
We are in a farming community, and our own children that we're sending to schools have no context to the fields that they're driving by on a daily basis. I want our children to understand what healthy food options are. I want them to understand why they're healthy food options.
Having an area where people can play basketball, play sports, do things like that, having a garden.
We have 7 tribes that have their headquarters within a 40-mile radius that have their own populations that have completely different structures and cultures.
When the child care team started talking about constructing this facility, one of the things that I knew right away is that we have to build it ourselves. And the way that we can do that is by creating the avenue in the business to make it work. And by doing that, we're turning the money back over, keeping as much of the resources within our community, within our tribe. We're gonna construct with federal dollars. We're gonna buy the land with federal dollars and marry them up. And then we're gonna create a company that creates a subsidiary that builds it, and we're going to turn the dollars over and hire our own people and train them at the same time. And when you put your minds together and you're all on the same page, then it becomes reality. And you just go to work and keep that faith.
All of our efforts are culminating in the fact that more Caddo people want to come home and be involved. And we couldn't ask for anything more than that, because tribal participation is really the end goal to everything that we're doing.
We have had to be resilient for so long, providing a safe space for children to set their baggage down that they don't even realize they have, and families to come in and just be happy with their kids is what I hope for in this space, because they're going to have to go out in the world and continue to be resilient.
When I'm no longer here, you know, and I move on to that other world after leaving this earth here that I'm passing through, this place will be here for a future.
Hey, you think you'll be chairman? You think so?
I'll make the tribe better.
And with that, I will conclude. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for sharing with us today. I appreciated your use of video as storytelling, and I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about why you started that practice and kind of guide us. Is that something that the architect, planner, preservationist, and real estate developer of the future ought to be able to do?
So I think narrative is really important. I think we at Mass think narrative is incredibly important to be able to tell the stories of our partners, and to lift up their voices in the development process is critical for project success, especially when we're trying to communicate the power that this project will have within the community. And so we internally have a film team that helps share those stories and goes with us to site visits to lift up and try and articulate what we're trying to do from a design standpoint. So and this comes to like how we present our work, to how we communicate our work with our partners. I think that narrative is really core to how we think about the work that we do on a daily basis, and something I try and communicate to students that I teach and so on. So I do think that's hugely important. Yes.
When you were talking about the 5 L's, you presented like seemingly opposing ideologies. I guess I'm interested in understanding how you reconcile those ideologies in the projects that you showed, but in other examples. I mean, it seems in the first project, idea of reusing building materials, leads to sustainability practices that you could attribute to some of those ideologies. But I guess I want to hear how you approach that reconciliation of those two approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very clear that capitalism's not going away, and we have to work within the systems that have been created. That doesn't mean we have to always be okay with them. And so the Wadi housing project, that if you kind of Google some of our past work, really called out ways in which we were leveraging federal funds to build artist studios. And so in many ways it's how do you, and some might say that's a bad use of taxpayer dollars, but in this case, 75% of the community members rely on the arts as a main source of income. So it behooves us as designers to kind of lift up the needs of the community. And so how do we navigate those policies to ensure that they're working for the communities? And so I'm always trying to wrestle, like, how far can we push the policies? And I mean, I've been fortunate enough to go back and forth between Canada and work with Indigenous Services Canada, which is equal to our Office of Native American Programs within HUD, and to look how regressive their policies are. But when it comes from an advocacy standpoint and from a population standpoint, they are very proactive in terms of lifting up Indigenous rights. I think it's the reverse here in the US, where our policies are pretty progressive, but we haven't used them, or we haven't pushed them to the fullest extent. There's a lot of flexibility, I think, within the policies that have been written. We just haven't seen the fullest potential of how to leverage them. So I mean, I'm always trying to reconcile that notion. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Oh, right over here. Yes. Sorry, I pointed.
Yes.
Okay.
It's on.
So I was wondering, I had a question sort of about when you talked about decolonizing spaces that have sort of been colonized for like generations and generations, and like how hard that can be, and like, you know, sort of where do we start and where do we compromise? And like, I was wondering, like, how are there ways where like we can sort of decolonize those already colonized spaces, and like how do we do that in a way that's more like meaningful and like in a conversation with the community and allowing them to like be a part of that process? And sort of, I guess I'm just having a hard time like thinking of it as less like decoration and like sort of like ornamentation, and how do we get down to like truly like rethinking how we even go about the process of like building, and like how do we get away from those Eurocentric ideas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how does it go from just being fluffy language to actually being real actionable item, like actionable? I wouldn't put the onus on the individual. Like, I don't think it is, you're not going to solve the issue of decolonizing the spaces in which you work. And I think I've had to reconcile that a little bit, because I had to kind of wrestle with that notion of decolonizing versus indigenizing. I often lift up when I'm giving a talk that my education was very much based in a Beaux-Arts Western ideology, but I'm in no way going to, like, I wouldn't give that back, right? That has kind of set forth a box of tools that allowed me to navigate these processes to hopefully reconstitute or rethink them as I'm applying them to the work that I'm doing every day. And I challenge you to do the same. Like, how would you kind of question the tools that you're being given, sharpen them, make them the best tools that you can, and then try and, if you're going to teach or apply them, how would you use them differently than within the kind of traditional systems that are our everyday? And that's the challenge. Like, if we just go down the rote process of just practicing and doing our everyday, I'd say that's fine and good for probably 75, 80% of the population, but it's not good for the other 25, 30% that really need to be challenging the ways in which our built environment impacts us all in different ways. I don't know. It's an attempt at your question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other question? Yes.
I just had a question. You were speaking about stewardship and the value of that within the Indigenous communities. And in particular, in this last video, many of the speakers were referring to training the community to put back into the community, to be able to really continue the work, not only in this project, but presumably in future projects. How much of that is a focus of your practice? Is that something you really are working? I know you mentioned something at the beginning about that.
Mm-hmm. a lot of our technical assistance is around like building the capacity of project managers to become good project managers, building the capacity to be good construction managers. And for those that have the capacity and the ambition to create community development corporations, construction companies, we're happy to kind of advocate and kind of move that process forward. I'd say it's not for everyone. There's a reason why architects are architects and have liability insurance, and why contractors take on a lot of risk. Like there's that kind of that risk and reward kind of space. And I think if communities want to be empowered and think about sovereignty and self-determination, taking the onus on is good. Like the ability to kind of, and it's ingenious, right? You have access to federal funds. Why not hire your own people rather than hiring outside the community? Why not build your own corporations to pay yourself to do your own work? Why not build your own health corporations to build your health facilities to deliver health care? Why not pay your own teachers to educate your own populations? Like that's all within our policies, and we can do that. And so, it's been done time and time again off reservation and within contemporary society. So why not do it for ourselves? So yes, I'd say that's a long-winded way of saying I think that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Since you spoke so much about having the community involved and really letting them lead the project, I was actually wondering if you'd come across issues of community buy-in and getting them actually involved in it. And if you did, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, one of the stories, we're on the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, and we're at a community meeting, having a kind of our first engagement meeting, and one of the family members comes up like, this is all fun and this is a great process. We enjoyed like coming and talking about the aspirations and the visions of this housing project, but all we really need is a roof over our heads. Like, and that's hard. So how do you navigate that is tough at times. You don't have the power to build housing. You can only help them navigate the process. And I think being very clear and leveling expectations is important. That these processes will take time, and we can't build housing in the next 6 months, the next year. The housing that you'll probably see is going to take 2, 3, 5 years before we can really understand and navigate the complexity around the funding sources that we have to put together to build the housing. And that can be tough at times.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Can you pronounce how to?
Nesais. So thank you. It's Northern Cheyenne. So for thank you. Nesais.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. I just want to acknowledge and appreciate all the ways that Joe has joined our community today. I'll just sketch that out quickly here in 30 seconds. We had a lunch where we gathered a range of leadership faculty, students, all of whom were interested in the topic of indigeneity. They gathered together in honor of Joe's visit. We had great conversation there. Joe was good enough to join Ronit Eisenbach's studio that's looking at the question of democracy and design and the intersections there. He spent a couple of hours with students there, furthering his contact with us. And now here, reflecting to us the difficult histories of our country, the violence, the displacement, the broken promises and the broken policies, but then also telling us the stories of how he's attending to those histories and working to repair. So we appreciate you telling your story and sharing it with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to